each species, and actually every little group or population within a species, is responding to environmental change in its own way. So it's not as if a whole ecosystem just gets up, marches north, and sits back down. We don't have, for example, coral reefs just getting up and moving with every piece of the reef out of the tropics. Rather, every species is exhibiting its own unique response.
What can the lay citizen or individual listening to us do in their own small way to control for species range shifts, particularly the negative implications related to species range shifts?
Other areas with large animals like elk and bears, best practices you can pay attention to while driving to be sure that you don't encounter any of them, which is probably best for you and your car as well. The last thing I'll mention, which is kind of a different type of engagement science, which anyone can do regardless of whether you own a home or a car, is identifying the species around you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's episode of Let's Talk. Again, I am so excited to host our guest for this episode, Dr. Alexa Fredston. In our previous video, she shared with us her experience in navigating her pathway into science. She also shared about her achievements, the challenges that she has faced, and the things that has inspired her to keep going. Definitely check out that video. I know you will be inspired and driven to keep going for more. You will see the link to that video in the bio. If you have already done so, then stay tuned for today's conversation with Alexa. On that note, welcome again, Alexa.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you here too. To start with, could you briefly share with us why you chose to study about species range shifts and climate change?
Yes, absolutely. I'm really interested in this question because it's one of the fundamental ways that human activities are transforming the planet. As a scientist, I get especially excited about questions that are both teaching us something new about the way the world works, revealing something fundamental about nature, and moving forward our ability to protect and manage natural systems. And this research area is really important to both of those things.
So my next question, I feel, is a little bit funny because the entire episode is to discuss species range shifts. But I want to ask, are species range really undergoing a shift? And if yes, what are the biological or climatic factors potentially driving the shift?
Well, first of all, let's just imagine that every species has a geographical range, which is the full extent of its distributions. If you put a dot on a map everywhere you found a particular plant or animal and then drew a blob around it, that would be its geographical range. We know from studies on every continent and every major taxonomic group, from insects to trees to whales, that species are shifting their geographical distributions. They're not doing it at random. On average, they're going up mountains, deep into the oceans, and towards the poles, away from the equator on both hemispheres. This is because the world is warming, and most species have evolved to exist in a particular climate. So as the world gets warmer, they move to stay within that climate. If a tree species historically really preferred or was most successful at, let's say, a temperate environment where the mean annual temperature was 66 degrees Fahrenheit, it is going to try to stay at 66 degrees Fahrenheit. Of course, trees aren't thinking of this, but they're going to be most successful in the parts of their range that are closest to that and keep growing into new habitats that are now suitable for it because of global warming.
Wow. Interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that, and also for the detailed examples you give. I feel like that always helps in visualizing the concept and making it more relatable. So thank you. Now, you mentioned that most of the widespread range shifts are due to climate change. So I want us to focus more on climate change. What are the primary implications of climate-related range shifts?
When species shift their ranges, a number of different things happen. First of all, each species, and actually every little group or population within a species, is responding to environmental change in its own way. So it's not as if a whole ecosystem just gets up, marches north, and sits back down. We don't have, for example, coral reefs just getting up and moving with every piece of the reef out of the tropics. Rather, every species is exhibiting its own unique response. On average, as I said, they're shifting towards the poles. But because they're doing it at different rates and in slightly different directions, ecosystems are reshuffling. We call this the global reshuffling of biodiversity. So where you might have previously had a particular flower and a particular insect coinciding, it might be the case that now the flower has shifted its distribution, the insect hasn't. So you end up with new sets of species interacting with each other. This has lots of consequences for us, even though it might sound like kind of an academic issue. A lot of the species that have shifted their ranges away from the tropics are pests or species that carry disease, like the mosquito that carries Zika virus, or the beetle that has decimated forests in North America. These are all climate-related range shifts that are causing huge problems for people.
Thank you for that. What are the questions your research seek to answer?
We know that the climate has a huge influence on where species are found in a landscape or a seascape. You're not going to find a polar bear in the tropics, and you're not going to find Nemo in the Arctic. And those are because those places are outside of the geographical ranges and the wrong climate. But that's not the only reason that species are constrained to their ranges. There are a lot of other processes that keep them where they are, and that could be anything from competition with another species. In the tropics, you often find bird species that look very similar but are different, with non-overlapping ranges, where clearly at the edges, they compete each other out. It could also be escaping a predator or looking for a trace mineral in soil. So the goal of my research is to get a more unified understanding of these drivers of why species are found where they are and not elsewhere, whether they're climate related or not, so that we can most accurately understand and predict species ranges. And while there's a lot that we know as a researcher, I often focus more on what we don't know. A big part of what we don't know that I'm trying to fill in is how these different processes like species interactions and population trends, whether the species overall is getting more or less abundant, and evolution and climate change, how those jointly interact to structure species ranges and their ability to avoid extinction in the future. But there are tons of other exciting open research questions in the field. Some of them are applied, like how to design conservation or protected areas for species on the move. And some of them are very theoretical, like how species spread through landscapes and how their genes spread with them. So if you think about acorns falling from a tree, the rate at which those acorns get carried beyond the range and established in the genes that they bring with them, and how that shapes the genetics of the whole population. So there's just a huge range of questions that I and my colleagues are working on, from these very theoretical ones to really applied ones.
That sounds so cool. So are there some results that previous studies have also found?
Absolutely. There are lots of stories of species that we care about shifting their ranges and becoming more successful. Sometimes that just means one country as opposed to another is really happy because they got a lot of those species. For example, on the east coast of North America, lobster, which is one of the most profitable fisheries, are shifting further and further into Canada, and in general becoming more abundant because a lot of their competitors have declined in that part of the ocean. So the fishing industry in New England and Canada is thrilled with this consequence. Further down the coast, mangroves, which are a species that supports a lot of other species. Mangroves underwater have these roots where a lot of small fish hide and feed until they grow big enough to safely venture into deeper waters. So we call them nursery habitats. Those are spreading up the east coast of Florida. They're limited by winters where it's freezing temperatures or colder. And so as Florida warms, they can spread into more and more habitat. And of course, that brings with them this great nursery habitat service that they're now providing to more of the coastal oceans.
Wow. So my question for you is that what can the lay citizen or individual listening to us do in their own small way to control for species range shifts, particularly the negative implications related to species range shifts? Is there something we can all do to make the world a better place?
I'm so glad you asked. And a lot of the range shifts that I mentioned are of problematic species. But truthfully, most of the species shifting their ranges don't cause these problems, and we would like them to survive. We don't want these things to go extinct. There are butterflies in California and brown bears in North America. So there are so many things that we can do to give these plants and animals a safe passage as they try to find a place where they can survive over the coming decades as the climate continues to rapidly change. If you have a home, one great way to support species that are on the move is by planting native plants that insects can pollinate, that birds will come to, and other small animals, giving them a stopover as they migrate through, where they can rest and find some food. There also are, in parts of the American West and other areas with large animals like elk and bears, best practices you can pay attention to while driving to be sure that you don't encounter any of them, which is probably best for you in your car as well. The last thing I'll mention, which is kind of a different type of engagement science, which anyone can do regardless of whether you own a home or a car, is identifying the species around you. There are lots of phone apps to help with this. One popular one is called iNaturalist. And these are incredibly educational and fun because you learn about the trees and birds and insects near your home. But they're also used by scientists like me to identify processes like range shifts. Australia has a really successful program where when people see fish or plants that they've never seen before near their home, they log it on an app. And scientists use the app to get early warnings of range shifts long before they're discovered by scientists usually. So participating in these citizen scientist programs and contributing what you know about the area around your home to our efforts to understand species on the move is a great way to participate in their conservation.
Wow, this has been a wonderful session with you, Dr. Alexa Fredston. I am so sure that our viewers have learned a lot through this episode and also gained much more insights into species range shifts and how we can all contribute in controlling the extent of species range shift. Yeah, thank you for honoring our invitation and coming to share your science and your story. To our viewers, we are glad you were able to stay till the end. I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from this episode. Until our next video, let's enjoy science together. My name is Emelia and I remain your host. Thank you.